Hey, Tim Warner here again, as usual. Today's topic is embracing your autism. I have autism spectrum disorder, sometimes called Asperger's syndrome, sometimes called ASD, whatever. I've got a diagnosis from a psychologist. I'll tell you a little bit more detail on all that momentarily. But the hope I want to convey in this demo is that I've found that my life has expanded significantly since the diagnosis, and I feel much better about myself than I did before. For example, thinking back to childhood, I've always felt a little bit different. I guess that's part of the human condition in large part. But I really felt pretty solidly that I had some differences going on, some awkwardness, my gait, my walking and running, a little bit overly self-conscious, and sometimes peers would point this out. I do have some bullying in my background. I'm not sure how much that relates to the autism symptoms. Maybe it does, actually, because I think quite a bit about how differences scare the group. And oftentimes, bullies will be the in-group, and any differences, people who are different from that in-group become the enemy. I know we see that in politics. I don't want to go there, but see that in squirrel populations. Think of the black squirrel being ostracized from the gray squirrel. Again, that's a whole rabbit hole, pun intended, we could go down. But I always did feel different and kind of weird. And honestly, I took that initially for the first 40-something years of my life as a negative. In other words, I'm awkward, I'm weird, that makes me a bad guy. And it produced a lot of shame. Over the last 13 years since our daughter Zoe's been on Earth, I've developed a lot of friendships with other parents. And, it was actually to their greatest credit, I think, that made me aware of getting tested for autism spectrum disorder, because I found that a lot of these parents, it seemed, would make remarks to my ex-wife or to me. Tim, you act a lot like my son who has ASD, or, Sood, your husband acts a lot like my husband who has autism. These things began bubbling up gradually over the last 13 years. And eventually it was just my native curiosity. I got to the point, well, what the heck, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. And I basically did that thing where you close your eyes, open a telephone directory, and land on a number. I pretty much picked the first autism tester, psychologist in Nashville I could find. That was a mistake, because it turns out that this woman had done quite a few autism evaluations, but only for kids. And I learned that there's an enormous difference in the testing protocols between kids, toddlers, are you kidding me? And a 52, 51, whatever I was at the time, around 50 years old, grown adult. And at the end of that process, she said, you do not have autism, because if you had autism, you wouldn't have asked me how my day was. You would just be ranting about your own stuff. And I thought to myself, okay, have you ever heard of masking? Masking is something that I, as an autistic person, have done since childhood, that involves covering up some of my differences by mimicking what other people do. What are these differences anyway? Well, hyperfocus, noticing the smallest details, doing my own thing, really, in a way that's entirely innocent and self-conscious, but may not be socially acceptable. And that's caused a lot of embarrassment for family and friends and those around me when I act out of context. So I've gradually learned this masking where I observe other people's behavior that's socially acceptable, and I unconsciously mimic it. You see, an example is I might be at a social event, and I'm standing in a social bouquet with some people. They're probably just thinking about whatever the conversation is that's going on and when they're going to get their next drink. And I'm looking at their body language and mimicking it. They chuckle, I chuckle. I've got a whole meta track going on in my head besides the one in which I'm there present to the conversation. So that's just one example. I found through my therapist, a good, qualified adult psychologist in Memphis, Tennessee, And he and I undertook a very long and rigorous, it took a few weeks to get through all of the multiple choice standardized tests. That took many hours. I did those online. And this psychologist and I conducted a number of in-depth interviews. We must have spent a dozen hours together. And he learned everything about my life, I'll tell you what. Really great guy. But at the end of the result, or the end result there is, I do in fact have autism. And you know what? It was incredibly freeing for me because my whole life immediately came into focus. It crystallized in as much as I realized a couple critical things. One, this explains my differences and my awkwardness and my trouble detecting cues and taking cues from people. I have an explanation to this now, finally. That's one. And two, even more important, I'm not this weirdo. I have differences. I'm neurodivergent. I have this autism spectrum disorder, but that doesn't make me damaged goods. That doesn't make me a bad or defective person. I'm a good guy. I really am. My alignment, I've determined, is lawful good. It really is. So it was a watershed moment. Now, if there is a trade-off, almost always there's a trade-off, as we know in IT in particular. The trade-off is there's no pill I can take to correct those differences. And frankly, I'm not sure I would take the pill even if one were offered, because autism conveys some huge superpowers. In my career as an IT trainer, I'm able to get smart on a subject very quickly. I'll give you a quick anecdote on that. Whereas I have always been heavily involved in databases and data engineering, so I've had that as a genuine interest and a genuine aptitude. I remember I was assigned by Pluralsight many years ago, I think 2015, 2014, to do some courses on Oracle database. Now, of course, I was familiar with Oracle database, but I hadn't had any occasion to really work with it in industry or teach on it before. So I was starting from zero with that, even though I did have the foundations of a relational data model and so forth. So in the course of just a couple weeks, I'm developing my first Oracle course, and they were very nicely received. I think they're still in the Pluralsight library even now, these years later. And I've had many people approach me in person in conferences or online in a Zoom user group or via email or whatever, saying, Tim, you really helped me get into Oracle as a career. You really helped me advance my skills. And I chuckle to myself in one sense, because I think, here's this person who's now using Oracle every day, and I'm sure they've forgotten more than I'll never know about Oracle, but I helped give them a really great leg up, and they think I'm still some kind of guru on it. I'm not. As you know, if you work in IT, if you're not sharpening the saw, it's going to get dull. I could get ramped back up on Oracle very quickly, because I've invested the initial blood, sweat, and tears in attaining my learning curve. But still, it makes me chuckle when I think that I went into it dead blind, and now I'm considered a guru by some people. It reminds me of the Wizard of Oz. Peek behind the curtain. Seriously. So where does this all end up in conclusion? Giving you hope if you feel that you may have ASD, if people have made comments to you in the past about your differences. And if you're fortunate enough, I know not everybody is fortunate enough to have the funds and or health insurance to pay for an assessment, but if you are, I would suggest that you consider it because, again, there's trade-offs. I know that some people are worried about a diagnosis affecting them for future health coverage and future jobs. All that's legitimate. I mean, I validate that. But on the other hand, think about your day-to-day experience. And I just know that I'm so much better off with that self-knowledge as opposed to before when I just thought I was a weirdo. Because now, if one of my differences kicks up and I have an awkward moment with somebody or with a group of people, I can think to myself, yeah, this is probably the old autism. In other words, I know that I have these challenges. And so what I can do is counteract them. There's no cure. But behaviorally, it's a question for me to realize what's going on. Oh, yeah, okay, I'm having some difficulty gauging this person's response. What's the response? Ask. That book, The 4 Agreements by Ruiz, helped me out a lot. One of the 4 agreements is don't make assumptions. And I think that's good for neurotypical and neurodivergent people. Who am I to assume that I know what's in your head? Who am I to assume what your motive is or how you're feeling right now, even if you have smoke coming out of your ears and your face is all red? I don't want to assume that you're hopping mad. I mean, so asking for clarification is really helpful. And fortunately, asking questions is really natural for me because that, I think, has some roots in my autism. Ever since I was a little kid, I pestered people with the old typical adolescent questions or pre-adolescent. Why? I still do that at the age of 53. Let me see here. Is there anything else on the subject that comes to mind immediately? Well, I'm grateful we just have so much more awareness about autism. If you were wondering about the terminology, this is just my understanding. Keep that in mind. Double check me going to Wiki and to other sources. But the reason why I don't like the term Asperger's syndrome is because Hans Asperger, the guy who's credited with first recognizing this neurodivergent situation, was around the time of the Nazis in World War II, and he collaborated with the Nazis. Again, I don't know the fine details. Honestly, when you're living in a totalitarian state and you're a psychologist and the government says, now you're going to do this, you probably are going to do this. So it's not like I think Hans Asperger was a really evil person, but he did work with the Nazi government to identify people based on these traits. And some people were executed as a result of his tests. So due to these sensitivities, you'll find that the term Asperger syndrome that really denotes the higher functioning end of autism spectrum disorder. Nowadays, I find, and I'm most comfortable just saying ASD or autism rather than saying Asperger syndrome. And also the word Asperger says ass. It's kind of awkward anyway. So take that for what it's worth. Thanks, as always, for hanging with me here. I hope you find these videos helpful. They're getting increasingly on the tangent of the IT industry, so I promise that in my next video, I'll bring it back more centrally to that topic. See ya.